In your songbooks to number 716. Appreciated the things that were shared so far, and I think it's very practical and applicable to our lives, especially the things that Raymond and Joe were sharing about hope and Raymond was talking about this continual, perseverance. So anyway, number 716, I'd like to sing this song, and then have a few thoughts to share. Midst the darkness, storm and sorrow. So I think it was 2 weeks ago where I had spoken about an observation that I made in the scripture that every time, 100% of the time that midnight is mentioned in the scripture, there's also deliverance from God. And I found that very interesting, and also a great reason for hope. And I'd like to look in the book of Psalms. If you want to turn there, Psalm 78 in the Septuagint is Psalm 77. And I'd like to read a few verses here. This is a common psalm where the psalmist here is recounting the history of Israel. And I'm going to read the first 12 verses. So this is again is Psalm 77, or in the Masoretic Psalm 78. And it says, "Give heed, O my people, to my law. Incline your ear to the words of my mouth. I shall open my mouth in parables. I shall speak of hidden things from of old, which things we heard. These we also knew, and our fathers described them to us. It was not hidden from their children in a different generation, who declare the praises of the Lord and his mighty deeds and his wondrous things he did. He raised up a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel. Whatever things he commanded our fathers, to make these things known to their children, that a different generation may know, children yet to be born. And they will arise and declare these things to their children, so they may put their hope in God and not forget the works of God, and seek out his commandments, so they may not be, like their fathers, a generation rebellious and embittered, a generation that did not keep its heart right, and its spirit was not faithful with God. The sons of Ephraim, who bend and shoot their bows, turn back in the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant, and they did not desire to walk in his law. And they forgot his good deeds and his wonders he showed them in the sight of their fathers, the marvelous things he did in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan." So it's interesting to me. I actually wasn't planning to share today until the theme was kind of set here, and I thought I'd get a look at this. So in Psalm 77, 78 here that we're looking at, there's 3 times where the word hope is brought up. And the first one of these we actually read here in verse 8. It says, I'm sorry, it's verse 7. "So they might put their hope in God and not forget the works of God." And it strikes me that it says to put their hope in God as if they have a hope already. And I think that makes sense, because I don't think people can live without hope. People can't live in hopelessness, and so people have their hope somewhere. And it says here that the desire is that they would set their hope in God. There's a lot of places where we could have our hope, and sometimes we do. Maybe in our experiences, maybe in our understanding, maybe in the temporal things around us. We have our life figured out. But all these things are going to fall apart sometime. And then where is our hope going to be? So I think there's something about the human experience, at least those who believe in the supernatural, that we want miracles to anchor us, or to show us that, yes, God is here, like God is present. And we want these miracles every day. You will recall that after Jesus fed the 5,000, then the people came back the next day, and they're like, can you do this again for us? And I think that's, kind of depicting how we can tend to be. But I don't think that's how it works. God isn't like a vending machine that every time we insert a prayer that God needs to give something to us. That's not in the plan of God. But instead, 1 Corinthians 10, that we've looked at many times in the past, it tells us that these things that happened in the past are reminders to us that God is there, even when we don't see these miracles happening every day. But we can tend to be a forgetful people. We can tend to forget the good works of God in the past, just like it speaks here of Ephraim in verse 9. It says, the sons of Ephraim who bend and shoot their bows, they turn back in the day of battle. And why did they turn back? It tells us in verse 10 that they forgot, or verse 11, because they forgot his good deeds and the wonders that he showed them. And I think the obvious question is, well, what should they have done? Well, what they should have done is they should have remembered the good deeds of the past. They should have remembered that they didn't come here on their own. They came here because of God having provided for them before. He opened up the Red Sea, otherwise they wouldn't be here. God did things for them in the past. That's how they've arrived here. They can continue to have confidence in God despite the fact that maybe they're not seeing a brand new miracle every day. So that's the first thing, that we are to place our hope in God. The second one, I'm not going to read the whole psalm here, but if you go down to verse 22, kind of breaking in here to the storyline of the account of Israel, it says in verse 22, just breaking in here, because they did not believe in God, nor put their hope in his salvation. And I think this can answer what we're supposed to be hoping for in God. We're to be hoping in his salvation. Salvation comes from the word save, and it's not just saving us in a spiritual sense or in our standing with God, not just in an eschatological sense of being saved in the future, but the assurance that God is looking out for us and saving us all the time, every day. He's there and waiting and watching over our lives. In 1 Corinthians 10, again, it's very interesting that after giving this whole account about the Israelites, how that's to serve as an example, it tells us, therefore, coming right out of this account, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. There's no temptation that's taken you, except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. It was a while ago, a few years ago actually, I'd gone through the book of James, and I had pointed out that the word temptation in Greek is the same word as the word trial in Greek, and so translators have to make a choice between temptations and trials. And in the book of James, I think it speaks of both of them, and they are actually differentiated only by translators. But nonetheless, it says here that God is not allowing you to be tempted beyond what you're able, or to face trials beyond what you're able, but he's going to provide a way out of it. It says in that verse, it says, but God is faithful. Well, where do we know that? Well, we know that because of our history, because of the history that we observe, because of the history that we read. We can see that God is faithful. And then going to the third instance of the usage of this word in this psalm is found in verse 53. And again, just breaking in here, talking about the people being led. It says, he guided them in hope, and they were not afraid. That's verse 53. He guided them in hope, and they were not afraid, and the sea covered up their enemies. So I think where the hope can lead us, we have our hope in God, we hope for his salvation, but it leads us to, the hope is a guide for us. He guides them in hope. And just like Israel, they didn't know the way. When they left Egypt, Maybe they figured out that we got to go, east, northeast or something. But that would not have been something to get them to the promised land. They didn't know the way to go. Instead, God was leading them. Moses didn't have a GPS or anything like that. In fact, they ended up at the Red Sea. Red Sea ahead of them, mountains on both sides. But God led them, and finally they arrived at the promised land. And I think the same thing is true for us. We don't know where we're going. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. We don't know what the rest of our life is going to look like. But we can have the confidence, if we're in the leading of God, if we're being led by God, that God knows where he's taking us. And that's all we need to know. We don't need to know any more than that. Raymond had mentioned about the continual responsiveness, and I think that's what God was looking for from them. I think it's what God is looking for from us. He wants to lead us in hope. It's a perseverance. When things are looking great, that's wonderful. But when things aren't looking great, we can be led in hope because we know that, as 1 Corinthians 10 says, God is faithful. So yeah, just blessed by those thoughts and blessed by the thoughts that were shared this morning, and the Lord bless you all.